So, what's happening? Well, to start, today, in 2009, I think that sexual division of labor is nearly a common knowledge. It was not the same in the 70s. Speaking of the sexual division of labor nowadays may seem terribly trite, nothing new, apparently, because it is now common knowledge. A few empirical examples. It's common knowledge that women earn less than men. It's the case in France, it's the case in Japan, it's the case in Poland, it's the case in every country. Of course, with differences. The situation is different from one country to the other, but we can see that in all the countries, women earn less than men, even with the same qualifications. Is it clear? This second fact, women are more often unemployed. Of course, the situation is changing. For instance, in Eastern European countries, the part of the unemployed women was very small. But in the last year, sometimes a part of the women had problems to stay at work. In a country like France, like Sweden, or like Portugal, the rate of employed women is very high, even when the women have one or two babies. In France, for example, 80%, more than 80% of the women with two babies are working. In other European countries, the situation is different. If you go maybe to countries like Spain, like Germany, like Italy, the women with babies have more difficulties to work. And the rate of employed women is a little bit lower. But in all the countries, the rate is is increasing. Okay? But there are big differences. The Japanese situation is very similar, with, of course, some specificities, very similar to Germany or to Spain or to Italy. Very different in comparison with France or Sweden. Okay? But in all the countries, women are more often unemployed. Third, women are responsible for practically all domestic work. Of course, sometimes you can find men who share a part of the domestic work. But in all the countries, women do more than men. And there are very few changes in that topic. In the French situation, for instance, we can see that in the last 30 years, very few things have changed about domestic work. It means that women, even now, make more domestic work than men, even if they are full employed on the other side. Okay? Another point, women are held down by a glass ceiling. It means that in all the countries, even if there are variations, in their career, the women have more frequently a smaller career than men. Another point also, women are quick to slide into the poverty trap. That's another important point. We can see that in all the countries too, there are much more women in the part of the population who has very little income. When you see in the case of France, people who are under the poverty line, we can see that 75% of the families under the poverty line are women alone with their children. So this is now very common knowledge, and this is only a few empirical facts. So you have to understand that, of course, there are very important national variations from one country to the other. Even you cannot compare Japan with Europe, because inside Europe you have very big differences from one country to the other. And I would say, in that case, we have three ideatypical countries. You have first the former communist countries, the Eastern European countries, where all the recent research in all the countries show that the situation of the women is going worse in comparison with men in the last 20 years. It means that the big change of Eastern countries was not in favor of women. This explains, for instance, that in a lot of these countries, there are thousands and thousands of women who emigrate. For instance, when you go to Ireland today, you can find a lot of young Irish people, particularly Irish women. If you go to Sweden, if you go to Germany, it's the same. If you go to Spain, you can find a lot of women coming from Romania, from Ukraine, and so on and so on. So the situation, we have here one student coming from Poland. She can probably also talk about the Polish situation. Personally, I published 2 books, collective books, in which there are papers about Eastern European countries, and all the papers go in the same direction. Of course, there are variations from one country to the other, again, but the situation for women is very often harder than before, because the possibilities to give children to institutions are smaller than before. Of course, with changes. You can have the same situation for East Germany, for instance. So, I stop this case. So, don't forget that 3 ideal-typical cases in Europe. 1, Eastern European countries with its differences. Second, I would say countries like Sweden, France, and Portugal. You can see it is not a difference between North and South. Sweden, Scandinavia, France, more or less in the middle, a part of France in the north, a part of France in the south, Portugal in the south. In these countries, you can see that there is a high employment rate for women, and at the same time, a high natality rate. In these countries, you have the highest natality rate in Europe. And on the other side, this is the third ideotypical countries we can distinguish in Europe, are countries where women, when they have babies, and if they work, are stigmatized with lower employment rate in that case. And in these countries, the natality rate, the fecundity rate, is much lower than in France, Sweden, or Portugal. These third ideotypical countries are countries like Germany, like the Netherlands, like Great Britain, like Italy, like Spain. Of course, with its differences, always. But you can understand that the Japanese case, that's why I make the difference, the Japanese case is very close from this third category. Because in Japan too, when women are married, they have more difficulties to work. When they are married and when they have children, the difficulties are increasing. And on the other side, you know, everybody knows that the natality rate, the fecundity rate in Japan is very low. So you can see that there is a situation of the Japanese situation is very close, even if the rates of employment or the rates of fecundity is even lower. It's very close to the third European category. Is it okay, clear? Well, I could explain more. I published 2 books in which there are more elements, and including comparisons, articles about each country. You can find this on my homepage. You will see. So, sexual division of labor is now common knowledge, I think. It's common knowledge that employment policies are gendered at all levels. Employment policies in all the countries are gendered, even in the countries where there is a discourse about equality. In the case of France, for instance, I published a paper a few years ago to show that there is a difference between the discourse, the public discourse, and the public practices. You have equality discourse, and you have public policies, practices, who are going in the opposite side sometimes. So I don't want to give more elements now. It's common knowledge that the inequalities between men and women are ranging from the highest spheres of the public sector to the labor contracts in small and medium firms. So I think that sexual division of labor is no longer a subversive concept. It was a subversive concept when it was invented as a concept in the 70s, even at the beginning of the 80s. Now, I think it has become an object of descriptive sociological study. And you can find a lot of empirical studies where the study is talking about sexual division of labor. Okay? So, the concept contains, in fact, 2 different ideas. First idea, the idea which stresses sharing work. Sharing work, men and women are assumed to have equal social status, but with complementary and attuned roles with respect to work. This is the traditional view. The traditional view who insists on the complementary of men and women, and maybe men and women are sharing work and nothing more. The other idea, and I make a difference between these ideas, is the idea that the division of labor reflects antagonistic social relations between sexes. You see, I come back to the idea I presented in the former sessions. So, hello. In the middle of the 90s, I will explain after why. It was a split of the original core group of women researchers working about sexual division of labor. The split was not into schools of thought battling over major paradigms. It did not follow the example of the English-speaking women historians we sometimes find ourselves envying, with a deconstructivist and postmodernist orientation on one side, confronting the champions of social history. I think you study history also? No? No, this was your friend who was here. But the historians know that big split who exists, particularly in the United States and United States, between the deconstructivist and postmodernist on one side, and the champions of social history on the other side. This split between the researchers working on sexual division of labor, nor did even the structuralist current, be they from the school of Pierre Bourdieu or not, take on methodological individualism or gain debate agent versus actor. So what's important to know is that it was a very big split in the middle of the 90s between the French researchers working on sexual division of labor, but the split was not between paradigms. It was not between schools or thoughts. It was different. I will try to explain. The split was of a different sort. There was, in fact, until 95, very little effort to distinguish oneself from one researcher to the other by strong theoretical assertions. It means the theoretical work was not strong enough. And why? First, because the before 1995 atmosphere demanded, particularly in France, that all conflicts and confrontations between researchers, scholars, be banned, and one devote oneself to one matter or another relating to women's situations. Why to ban the conflicts, the confrontation, theoretical confrontation between the scholars and the researchers? Mainly because the institutional situation of gender in France was very, and even now, is very bad. It means there are very few positions of professors or assistant professors specialized in gender. And so the researchers thought it is better not give publicly the confrontation or the conflicts between the researchers to make a common group to build better institutional positions. Underneath all this was the clear understanding that male domination was self-evident. There was a loss of interest in sociology's conceptualization of social relation as antagonistic. You see, I insist all the time on this, because precisely this was the point of the split in 1995 between the researchers. Some researchers who insist on the antagonism and other researchers who didn't want to insist on this. So, new step from the middle of 95. Remember, I told you about that the last time, I think, or the time before. 1995, why was it so important? Because there was a very big social movement in France with strikes, few weeks, and at that moment there was a big division amongst the scholars and the researchers. Some of them supported the strikers and even striked themselves, participate to demonstrations and so on, and others who supported the government. The first are mainly people who consider the antagonism. Of course, the antagonism was in the public life, in the social movement, in the strikes in that moment. And they also insist on antagonism about sexual division of labor. And on the other side, you have other researchers and scholars who don't insist on that because they are much more mainstream, I would say. And in doing that social movement, they supported the government or they did say nothing. So, new attempt to draw a theoretical framework that grows out of the simultaneous excuse my English, consideration of both the sexual division of labor and the social relation between the sexes. So I write it again here. The important thing is that a part of the researchers and the scholars associated clearly sexual division of labor and social relations between the sexes, and the other part didn't do that.